On the 17th of March 2000, in a federal building in Washington, the oldest name in American handguns signed what it believed was a peace treaty. Within a year, that signature had nearly wiped the company off the map. The document was an agreement with the Clinton administration, brokered at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Smith & Wesson, the company whose revolvers had armed the Union cavalry, the lawmen and outlaws of the American West, and generations of American police, agreed to a list of reforms. It would develop so-called smart guns. It would impose a code of conduct on its dealers. It would change how it marketed its products. In exchange, a wave of city lawsuits threatening to bury the entire gun industry would be dropped against it. To the executives who signed, it looked like survival. To the company's own customers, it looked like surrender. The National Rifle Association said Smith & Wesson had run up the white flag. Within weeks, gun clubs, dealers, and tens of thousands of ordinary buyers organized a boycott, refusing to buy anything new with the Smith & Wesson name, and dumping their used ones onto the market to undercut it. Sales fell 40%. The company suspended manufacturing at 2 plants. The chief executive, who had negotiated the deal, was forced out by that September. By December, the stock was trading at 19 cents a share. And in the spring of 2001, the British conglomerate that owned Smith & Wesson sold it, the whole company, a century and a half of history, for $15 million, a fraction of what it had paid, to a tiny startup in Arizona whose main product was trigger locks. The thing that nearly killed America's oldest handgun maker was not a competitor. It was not a war, or a depression, or a better gun. It was a signature, and the customers who never forgave it. This is the story of a company that was built twice, that ruled its market for 100 years on a patent it borrowed from a man it ruined, and that came closer to death than almost any name in this series, and survived. It survived by breaking its own word, and by abandoning the home it had kept for 170 years. It is the story of the one that lived, and of exactly what living cost it. Every week, we tell the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the decisions that built or destroyed the world's most important firearms brands. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins in 1852, and with a failure that became somebody else's empire. Horace Smith was a craftsman, a man who had spent years in the New England contract arms trade, a maker of things to fine tolerances. Daniel Baird Wesson came from a family of Massachusetts gunmakers. His older brother was already an established maker of rifles. In 1852, the two men formed a partnership, the first Smith & Wesson in Norwich, Connecticut, to build a repeating pistol around a clever, self-contained cartridge and a lever mechanism. The gun was called the Volcanic. It did not work well. The ammunition, a hollow bullet with the powder packed in its base, was underpowered and unreliable. The company drew investment, but not enough sales, and it stumbled toward insolvency. Its largest investor was a shirt manufacturer from New Haven named Oliver Winchester. Winchester took control of the failing firm, reorganized it, and set it on the path that would make it, within a decade, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Smith & Wesson had built the seed of one of the greatest names in American firearms and handed it to another man. If you have seen our film on Winchester, you have already met the far end of this story. It began here, as their failure. But the two men took the money from selling out, and they did something rare. They built the company again, from scratch, and better. In November 1856, they reformed their partnership in Springfield, Massachusetts, a city that would be Smith & Wesson's home for the next 170 years. And this time, they were not chasing a clever cartridge, they were chasing a monopoly. The opening was specific, and it was closing fast. Samuel Colt's master patent on the Revolver, the patent that had given Colt a near-total grip on the American handgun for 2 decades, was about to expire in the mid-1850s. The moment it did, the field would be wide open. Wesson had spent those years perfecting something Colt did not have, a true, self-contained metallic cartridge, the little .22 rimfire, the first American cartridge of its kind. A revolver that fired such a cartridge would load from the rear, cleanly, in seconds, while every Colt in the world was still being loaded from the front with loose powder, ball, and cap. There was one obstacle, and it was the whole game. To fire a rear-loading cartridge, the revolver's cylinder had to be bored all the way through, open at the back, not closed like Colt's. And the patent on the bored-through cylinder was already held by another man. His name was Rollin White. He was a former employee of Colt's own factory. As the story is usually told, White had shown the idea to Colt, and Colt had thrown it away. In 1856, Smith & Wesson went to Rollin White, and here they made the decision that reveals exactly what kind of company this was going to be. They did not make White a partner. They did not buy his patent outright. They licensed the exclusive rights to it, and agreed to pay him a royalty of 25 cents on every revolver they sold. In return, White would be responsible for defending the patent himself, every lawsuit against every infringer, out of his own pocket. Hold that detail. It made Smith & Wesson's fortune, and it destroyed the man who made that fortune possible. We will come back to him. For now, the arrangement did exactly what it was designed to do. It handed Smith & Wesson a legal monopoly on the cartridge revolver in the United States. The Model 1, introduced in 1857, a small 7-shot .22, was the first commercially successful revolver in the world to use self-contained metallic cartridges. It was not powerful. It did not need to be. It was modern in a way nothing else on the market was. And when the Civil War came, Union soldiers bought them by the thousands with their own money, wanting a backup that could be reloaded in the dark, in a hurry, without spilling powder down the front of a cylinder. And here is what the monopoly meant in the plainest terms. For roughly the entire span of the Civil War and the years around it, no other American company could legally build a cartridge revolver. Not the small makers, not the famous ones. Colt itself, the giant of the American handgun, was locked out of the future of its own product, forced to keep selling percussion revolvers while a young firm in Springfield owned the only legal path forward. When rival makers built bored-through cylinders anyway, White's lawsuits forced them, in a number of cases, to stamp the humiliating words "manufactured for Smith & Wesson" on the very guns they had tried to sell in competition. That is what a patent, properly enforced, was worth. It was not paperwork. It was a wall around an entire technology. By 1870, Smith & Wesson was ready to step up from the pocket .22 to a serious weapon. That year, it brought out the Model 3, a large-frame, single-action, top-break revolver in a genuine man-stopping caliber, the .22. 44. The top-break design was itself a selling point. The barrel hinged down, and the mechanism ejected all the spent cases at once, so a shooter could dump and reload far faster than with a Colt, whose cases had to be poked out one at a time through a side gate. The Model 3 built Smith & Wesson's reputation across 2 continents. In 1871, the Imperial Russian Army ordered some 41,000 of them, chambered for a cartridge that would forever be called the .44 Russian, an enormous foreign military contract that ran the Springfield factory hot. A modified version, designed with input from the U.S. cavalry officer named Major George Schofield, went to the American Army. It is remembered as the Schofield. The Japanese Navy bought the later new Model 3. Australian colonial police bought it. And on the American frontier, the Model 3 became one of the defining guns of the West. It was carried, by various reports, by Wyatt and Virgil Earp, by Pat Garrett, by Theodore Roosevelt, by Annie Oakley, by Jesse James, and, in one of the grimmer footnotes, the revolver Bob Ford reportedly used to shoot Jesse James in the back of the head was a Smith & Wesson. Then the wall came down. In 1869, the Rollin White patent expired, and White's attempt to renew it was rejected. The monopoly that had built Smith & Wesson evaporated. The early 1870s saw an explosion of competing cartridge revolvers, and leading the charge was the company that had been locked out the longest, Colt. In 1873, Colt introduced its single-action army, the Peacemaker, in a more powerful .45 cartridge, on a frame many shooters judged stronger and more reliable than the top-break Smith & Wesson. If you have seen our Colt film, you know how that gun went on to define the myth of the West. What matters here is the reversal. The firm that had spent 15 years locking Colt out of the future now had to compete with it on open ground, and Colt took the frontier.
Smith & Wesson's answer was not to fight Colt on the single-action revolver. It was to leapfrog it. Around the turn of the century, the company perfected the design that would carry it for the next 100 years. The hand ejector, a revolver with a cylinder that swung out sideways on a crane for fast, simultaneous loading, the layout nearly every modern revolver still uses. Built into a medium frame and chambered for the .38 Special, it became the military and police, later the Model 10.
It would become, by most measures, the best-selling handgun design of the century, the revolver on the hip of American police officers for generations. Smith & Wesson had lost the frontier and won the 20th century. And then it built the guns that made the name legendary. In 1935, it introduced the .357 Magnum, the first Magnum revolver cartridge, a round so far beyond anything before it that Magnum entered the language as the word for overwhelming power. In 1955, it went further still, chambering a massive N-frame revolver for the new .44 Magnum, driven in part by the wildcatting of a hunter named Elmer Keith, who wanted a handgun that could kill large game. The gun was designated the Model 29, and at its introduction, it was the most powerful production handgun in the world. For 16 years, the Model 29 was a specialist's tool, a gun for hunters and enthusiasts, made in modest numbers. Then, in 1971, a lean actor named Clint Eastwood pointed one at a man on a San Francisco sidewalk and asked whether he felt lucky. Dirty Harry turned the Model 29 into the most famous handgun on Earth overnight. Retailers could not keep it on the shelves. It sold at a premium above list price for years, when it could be found at all. This was the peak, the moment when Smith & Wesson was not just a gun maker, but a piece of American culture, the name that meant a revolver the way a revolver was meant to be. At the peak, the family that had run it for 113 years let go. In 1965, the Wesson interests sold their controlling stake to a conglomerate called Bangor Punta, which folded the gunmaker into a portfolio and pushed it into law enforcement gear beyond firearms. From that moment, Smith & Wesson was no longer run by gunmakers. It was an asset. It passed from Bangor Punta to another corporate owner, and then, in 1987, to a British industrial conglomerate called Tompkins, which paid $112.5 million for it. The oldest name in American handguns was now owned and run for returns by a company on the other side of the Atlantic. Which is how a British conglomerate came to sign a political agreement in an American election year that its American customers experienced as a betrayal. We began with that signature. Now you can see it for what it was. In March 2000, with the gun industry facing a coordinated wave of lawsuits from more than a dozen cities, an effort explicitly modeled on the litigation that had just brought the tobacco industry to heel, the Clinton administration offered Smith & Wesson a way out. Sign the reforms, and the suits go away. Tompkins, a British firm with no feel for the American gun owner's politics and a balance sheet to protect, signed. The company agreed to smart gun development, dealer codes of conduct, and marketing restrictions that its own customers read as an admission that their guns were the problem. Consider the exposure the way the boycott organizers did, because this is the mechanism that nearly ended the company. A gunmaker does not sell to governments the way a defense contractor does. It sells to individuals, millions of them, who choose the name on the gun and who are, as a group, intensely political about exactly this issue. The instant those buyers decided that Smith & Wesson had sided with the people trying to regulate them, the company's entire market could turn on it at once. And it did. There was no factory failure, no defective product, no rival with a better revolver. There was a signature and a customer base that simply stopped buying. Sales collapsed by 40%. The stock fell to 19 cents. The company that had armed the American West was, within 12 months, worth almost nothing. The sale that followed in 2001 is one of the great fire sales in industrial history. Tompkins, desperate to be rid of it, sold Smith & Wesson to Safety Hammer, a startup in Scottsdale, Arizona, that made gun locks. The price was $15 million against the $112.5 million Tompkins had paid 14 years earlier. With assumed debt, the whole thing came to about $45 million. A century and a half of the most famous name in American revolvers, the maker of the gun in Dirty Harry's hand, changed hands for less than the cost of the marketing campaign it would take to repair the damage. And here the Smith & Wesson story diverges from every other one in this series. Rigby, Lee Enfield, Mauser, Remington, all of them, when the outside blow landed, went down or were carved up. Smith & Wesson did the one thing that saved it. It repudiated the deal. The 2000 agreement had in practice no teeth, the incoming administration declined to enforce it, and no other gunmaker ever signed a similar one. The new owners quietly walked away from its terms. More than that, they did the opposite of what it demanded. They leaned hard into exactly the market the agreement had tried to constrain, introducing high-capacity pistols and, for the first time in the company's history, a military-style rifle, an AR-15 pattern gun. The boycott faded as the memory of the signature faded. Within a decade, the company was selling more than 100,000 of those rifles a year and posting record revenues. Smith & Wesson had been brought back from 19 cents a share not by honoring the promise that nearly killed it, but by breaking it. That survival set up the last act, and it is the same act that ended our Remington film, The Flight South. By the early 2020s, those rifles, the ones the 2000 agreement had tried to restrain, the ones the boycott-era company had bet its recovery on, made up more than 60% of Smith & Wesson's revenue. And the company was headquartered in Massachusetts, a state with some of the strictest gun laws in the country, where legislators proposed extending the assault weapons ban to prohibit manufacturing those rifles inside the state at all. Faced with a law that would outlaw making the product that was now most of its business, Smith & Wesson left. In 2021, it announced it would move its headquarters out of Springfield, its home since 1852, to Maryville, Tennessee, a $125 million new facility in a state whose governor welcomed it in the name of the Second Amendment. The new headquarters opened in the autumn of 2023. The company kept a reduced operation in Springfield, still forging and assembling revolvers there. But the head of the oldest name in American handguns now sat in Tennessee. After 170 years, it had abandoned the town its name was born in. So Smith & Wesson lives. It is today a thriving public company, traded now as Smith & Wesson Brands, after passing through the ownership of that Arizona startup, a renamed holding company, and a brief spell inside a broader outdoor products conglomerate before being spun back out on its own. Its revolvers and pistols sell in every gun shop in the country. On the collector market, the objects hold their history plainly. The tiny Model 1 that started it, the .44 Russians and Schofields of the frontier, the pre-war registered Magnums, the early Model 29s that Dirty Harry made untouchable, all actively collected, all worth real money, because they were made in a place and a tradition that the balance sheet has been steadily leaving behind. But we owe you the return we promised, to the man whose patent made all of it possible. Rollin White drew a royalty of 25 cents on every revolver Smith & Wesson sold under his patent, and in the beginning, that must have looked like a fortune in the making. It was not. Because Smith & Wesson had made him not a partner, but a licensor responsible for his own patent's defense, White spent the boom years of the cartridge revolver in court, suing infringer after infringer, at his own expense, to protect a monopoly whose profits flowed mostly to two other men. The legal costs consumed him. By most accounts, the man who held the single most valuable patent in the history of the American revolver, the bored-through cylinder, the idea Colt had thrown away and Smith & Wesson had built an empire upon, ended his life in financial ruin, having paid to defend the very thing that made other men rich. He is the third figure in this series, after the engineer whose name Winchester erased and the ballistician whose name the Lee Enfield dropped, to invent the thing and be crushed by the people who sold it. What the Smith & Wesson story really tells is not a story about revolvers. It is a story about survival and its price. Every other company in this series was killed by a force that had nothing to do with the quality of its guns. A collapsed empire, a mountain of debt, a foreign army, a treaty. Smith & Wesson was struck by exactly that kind of force. Not a rival, not a defect, but a signature and a boycott. A purely political wound. The difference, the only difference, is that it did not die. And it is worth being honest about how it lived. It lived by building its fortune on another man's patent and leaving him to ruin. It lived, a century and a half later, by giving its word to the government and then taking it back when its customers punished it. And it lived by leaving the town that had carried its name since before the Civil War because the law there would no longer let it make what it now sold. The name survived. It thrived. It is one of the few in this series you can still buy new off a shelf tomorrow. But the name is the part that survives easily. Ask what it cost. Ask Rollin White. Ask the people of Springfield. Ask the promise made in a federal building in March 2000 and unmade the moment it became inconvenient. And you start to see that in this business, survival and integrity were almost never the same thing. The companies that kept their word tended to die. The one that broke it is still here. Somewhere tonight, there is a Smith & Wesson revolver in a nightstand drawer, a swing-out cylinder, a .38 or a .357, the design that put the company on every police belt in America for 100 years. It works exactly as it was built to. The stamp on the frame reads Smith & Wesson, Springfield, Massachusetts. The head office that name belonged to is in Tennessee now. The man whose patent made the whole thing possible died with nothing. The gun still fires. It always did. That was never the part that was in question. If you want to keep hearing the stories of the engineers, the factories, and the companies that outlived everything, including sometimes their own word, subscribe and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.